Stop what you're doing and take a look around you. What was here before you were? Who lived here where you live 500, 1,000 years ago? What languages did they speak? What about the people who started our town? How did it become the unique place that it is today? What is the legacy that they left for us to enjoy, and what sort of legacy are we leaving the next generation? That's what the Fairfield History Series is all about. People coming together from very different parts of our community to do something that connects us, not only by deeply researching our past, but by pooling our creative resources to record the stories of our shared history. This is how we create a lasting legacy for future generations. So far, we've completed 3 award-winning documentaries. The first one told of our story from prehistoric times to that of the native peoples who lived here. And in our second film, we introduced you to some of our heroes who did extraordinary things to make a difference in our community and in our world. And in our third film, we explored the evolution of agriculture, from native seed keepers to a surprisingly diverse group of modern-day farmers. We're now beginning our fourth film, called Ahead of Their Time. It offers a glimpse into the hearts and minds of some of the most determined entrepreneurs and trailblazers who inspired the growth of business and government in and around Fairfield, Iowa. Ahead of Their Time celebrates the town's out-of-the-box thinkers, movers, and shakers, and the unstoppable spirit that helped our town both survive and thrive. The Fairfield History Series is a community project unlike any other, and now we're asking you to join us. How would you like to be a part of it? First things first, if you haven't seen these films, please take the time. Once people catch the bug and they want to be a part of it as soon as they see the film. Second, you can join our research team or maybe share your family's story on camera or help with the video production. Lastly, you can become a legacy member and contribute to each of our films. It costs $60,000 to produce each film. So however you choose to help, we invite you to join us. Together, let's make our local history come alive. Thanks. We're happy to have you here. My name is Dick DeAngelis. I'm the director and the producer of the Fairfield History Series. I want to welcome you on behalf of Fairfield Productions, Fairfield Media Center, and the Fairfield Public Library, all partners of this project, and to talk to you today about our research into the early entrepreneurs of Fairfield. So, we are doing, as you kind of can hear from this presentation, you'll hear about the Fairfield History Series. Well, that's an 8-part documentary film series that features 8 particular feature films. And you heard just about it recently, just on that little video. So we're happy to have you here. With me is the Director of Historical Research for the Fairfield History Series, Lawrence Eyre. Now, Lawrence, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks, Steve.
Lawrence is an Iowa-born Yale graduate who's been teaching history at Maharishi School for here in Fairfield for over 30 years now, right? And he also is a writer. He's written 2 books, haiku books. And one of them he wrote after or right around the time that we did our last film, A Place to Grow, about farming, and that's called Haiku Country. I'm not trying to plug your book, but I actually wrote my little haiku. If you love haiku, oh, well, I've forgotten it now.
I appreciate the thought.
And if it's good, you should buy Haiku Country.
Thank you very much, Dick.
There's
I
my
appreciate
talent
it
for the day.
Thank you.
Hey, I'm so happy that you're joining me doing this. as you know, we can't give this presentation live at the library, but through the magic of Zoom and Jason Strong at Fairfield Media Center, we're presenting this to you. So before we go any further, let me say this. This presentation is supported by Humanities Iowa and the National Endowment for the Humanities. So the views and opinions expressed by this program do not necessarily reflect those of Humanities Iowa or the National Endowment for the Humanities. Okay, I've gotten that out of the way, and it's important, but let's talk about what we mean by entrepreneurship. So the definition that I use, and one of the things I do when I look at producing a film, the definition I use was formulated by Professor Howard Stevenson. He's the godfather of entrepreneurship, I guess, is what he's known as. He's actually he is a professor of entrepreneurial studies at Harvard Business School. And according to Stevenson, entrepreneurship is the pursuit of opportunity beyond resources controlled. So pursuit just implies a singular, relentless focus, right? And I'd say, I guess my way of putting this would be people with vision going for it when things aren't handed to them, which is another way of putting it if you didn't teach at Harvard Business School. And of course, I didn't even attend Harvard, but I did attend a fabulous school. So we're going to talk today about entrepreneurs, businesses, and organizations of early Fairfield, Iowa, and their attempts to anticipate and respond to the needs of the time in order to have their community either survive or even thrive at different points. And we are not going to talk today, even though the film will address this, about more current things. Like there's a whole area that I'm learning a lot from Pete Nelson and Roger Voorhees about today's industries, et cetera. We're not going to cover that now. We're going to really focus on the early times, just because we don't have 5 hours to talk to you today. And I do want to share this. The reason I'm doing this is there's a number of reasons, but one is I want to give you an idea how much research goes into our project here when we do these films, even though you only see kind of the little creme de la creme of the research. We really do quite a bit of research. So we'll be sharing with you not only some of the research, but also some of the people we're talking to get kind of the rest of the story, if you will. So Fairfield today is known as a very highly entrepreneurial town, and many of its institutions are attracting young, creative people who start new businesses and bring new ideas here. So that's why we're focused on this idea of, well, what is this quality of entrepreneurship and how does it play itself out in the earliest days? I guess we discussed in our first film at length, Life Before Fairfield, the two major tribes that were living here, the Iowa and the Meskwaki, right? So the Meskwaki came in the last 100 years or so, I think around 1732 approximately. The Iowa, on the other hand, basically they're descendants of the Oneota, as were the Oto and the Missouri tribes. So all three of those are part of the Oneota culture. And when I say the Oneota, that wasn't the name of the people, it's the name that's been ascribed to them by the archaeologists to kind of give us an idea. It has to do with the kind of pottery, et cetera, that they made at that time, a woodlands group. So gives you, there's evidence that the Oneota used chert from southeast Iowa, actually. Chert just like this piece of chert that was found in southeast Iowa. Isn't that cool? Up near Lockridge, up on the Skunk River, near the Skunk River. Not that I want everyone to go there and take all the chert from there, but you can see on some of the pieces of chert, there's actually markings where someone tried to make possibly a point, and sometimes they chipped off and they threw them out and moved on. I always find those really interesting, but that chert was used to make tools, and the Iowa also mined pipestone from as far away as Minnesota. Pipestone is also known as catlinite. And it's a type of red, carvable, very soft rock. And it's used by Native Americans for pipes and effigies, like this pipe that I'm going to show you here. And you see they even have a, I believe, an eagle that's carved on the top of that. And this is just for demonstration purposes. I don't want you to worry about me. I don't use it, but I think it's fascinating. By the way, this is a Native American's sacred grounds, and it's actually a designated area. Only can be mined by Native Americans, so you can't go there and start taking kaolinite or pipestone. But you can purchase something like this, which I did, from someone who is Native American and has a store or is doing something like this. This is not an old piece, but I wanted to give you an idea what it looked like. So according to Lance Foster, and he's the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer of the Iowa tribe, you might remember him in that picture from one of our first film or third film. Lance has become a good friend, and according to Lance, pieces made from these materials were given as gifts to visiting tribal leaders, and that's interested me because I asked him, what are the beginnings of trading? Because that's really an entrepreneurial process, right? And Lance said the beginnings were used as gift giving. So if you had something special, just like you would in your own home, and if someone comes to visit and you've made your favorite jam or something, what do? Usually you give them something as a gift. Welcome to our home. Well, that would be the same thing if the Iowa tribe might give a gift like this as a gift to welcome a tribal leader or somebody who's coming into that area. Certain goods and resources were valued by many Midwestern tribes for either their beauty or their strength or their ceremonial or perceived spiritual value. So the by the way, with people coming to visit, reminds me of a story Lance told me, which said, he said there's a tradition that says that if you wanted to know the name of someone who was coming to visit you, listen to the meadowlarks, because they knew who people really were and their real identity. So when some stranger's approaching, the meadowlark called out who that stranger was, or his or her real name. And of course, that's some value for the person too. Maybe you would go out into the woods to learn that deeper identity. I thought that was interesting. Iowans traded regularly with other tribes. So something that I found interesting, it's a map of Native American trails that were scoped out really early when first European settlers got here, and the people who identified these trails, some of which became our roads, because they were the easiest way for people to travel. That's why they were Native American trails that could have been hundreds of years. And if you can see right in the middle there, that's Fairfield. Fairfield's on a little, just the town's on a little plateau. And there are, all trails lead to Fairfield is what I'm trying to tell you. It does seem like Fairfield could have been a, for hundreds of years, a hub for trading or a meeting place for tribes to gather, according to John Dorshuk, who's the state archaeologist for the state of Iowa. So from what I can tell right now, our research that we've done so far, all other Indian tribes especially like to trade for the Iowa pipes. These tribes usually communicated using Plains Sign Language. I've been working with a number of people to oh, by the way, even after the Europeans arrived, the Iowa trading continued with those Europeans. And they were known at that time for trading beaver pelts and other furs to the French. By the late 1600s, early 1700s, the trade with Europeans included maple syrup, furs, beads, etc. And sometimes for whiskey or for guns, weapons. As researchers, we still have a lot to learn about this area. But one of the things that I'm committed to is to tell you a little bit about our Native American ancestors, if you will, geographical ancestors, certainly. Things didn't start in 1830 or whatever. They started well before that. This trading and this activity of the woodland people go back at least 1,000 years, and others that were here that we found evidence of much earlier, like 10,000 and 12,000 years ago. So it's important to know that. If you haven't seen Life Before Fairfield, I highly recommend it to you. We're working with a few other people. I just wanted to tell you who. Bill Green was at the Office of State Archaeologist. He's done a lot of work on Toolsboro, if you know Toolsboro. Bill is extremely kind and helpful. He's also been an adjunct professor of anthropology at Beloit College, and at the director of the Logan Museum of Anthropology at Beloit. So we're working with Cynthia Peterson and John Dorshuk from the Office of State Archaeology, and with Dale Essick, who's from Ottumwa, who's a great, he has one of the largest collections from the Iowaville area, where the Iowa were last situated in our area, just outside of Jefferson County, but in an area that I conclude as part of Jefferson County. I kind of think of the people, the Iowa is kind of, in this area, is occupying the land between the Des Moines River and to the southwest, and the Skunk River to the northeast, okay? That's kind of how I define Jefferson County. It's a little bigger than it is today. But it's the land between those two rivers, of course, in the land between two rivers, the Mississippi and the Missouri. So we'll work with him. And then next week I go visit Loyal Fulton, for those of you who know Loyal. And he's also the cousin of Susan Fulton Welty, from whom we have the knowledge we have. Susan's book, Fairfield.
This is our Bible.
Well, certainly historically, it ends up being an extremely important thing. So, Lawrence, you want to maybe take over from there and tell people a little bit about the early days of as the Europeans came in and some of the fun things that we found out that maybe you could share with them?
Thank you. Yes, Dick. In 1835, the United States Army, seeking to really explore the huge amount of territory that still remained unvisited from the Louisiana Purchase all the way back in early 1800s, under President Thomas Jefferson, commissioned Stephen Watts Kearny, a colonel, and his cavalry, known as the U.S. 1st Dragoons, to explore the watershed between these two rivers that Dick just referred to, the Des Moines to the south and the Skunk to the north and east of our present-day county of Jefferson. Our county was named after President Thomas Jefferson, even though some felt that it perhaps should be named after the very first representative from our area to the Iowa Territorial Legislature. His name was Mr. Coop, Colonel William G. Coop, and he was modest enough to realize that we wouldn't have this area had it not been for the president, the third president, Thomas Jefferson. So he said, perhaps we should name it for President Thomas Jefferson, and they did. It was the goal, as with Lewis and Clark, of all these explorers to catalog what they found as natural resources, as well as the geographic, just the lay of the land, for potential settling. They wanted to know, would there be clay for building? There was here. Would there be coal for fuel? There was. Would there be stone for building? They found limestone and sandstone in great abundance. What kind of trees were there? They found hickory, they found elm, they found, we'll soon see, a tree of great value known as linden to us, basswood to others, or bee trees, and we'll be hearing about that in a couple minutes. They found nuts, they found honey, they found fruit for food, they found topsoil deeper than their own wagon wheels, and they found in season, because they came at the end of May and went through the summer on their expedition, they found, and I quote you from the extensive, meticulous journals of Stephen Watts Kearny, they found prairie covered with strawberries in such abundance as to make the whole track red for miles. So they found what Anton Till in our very first film has referred to as a paradise here on the
Now, when you
prairie.
say it's red, Lawrence, what was it red from?
Just the strawberries you're crushing under their wheels and under the horses' hooves.
Wild strawberries, amazing.
Remarkably, they had with them beeves, as they called them. We would say cows who were milking at the time. And so long before there was ever the Wimbledon tennis tournament, we had Stephen Watts Kearney and his Dragoons enjoying strawberries and cream here on the prairies of Iowa.
What a life. They must have felt like they were in heaven. You know, there's other things. Can you share with us some of the other things they found? Or can I don't know if you had it, but I remember them talking about wildlife. And
yes.
Do you have that?
Plenty of deer. I know you're a fisherman, so I'll let you tell the fishing stories. These are true, folks. He's not exaggerating. Go ahead.
Deer, it says, I remember, deer in abundance furnished game, while large number of turkey, grouse, ducks, prairie chickens rose in alarm as the Dragoons came through. And he said, in every stream, pike, pickerel, catfish, trout, and other varieties of fish were found. Can you imagine that? So I just thought that was amazing to see the diversity of wildlife that was here. So if ever you want to know what was this area like before it got changed, there is this beautiful description and detailed description.
It's certainly true that we rely, whenever possible in our research, on primary sources, first-hand accounts of people who encountered this land and the resources it had and the other people who were already living here. And so it's especially valuable for us to have such meticulous records being kept by Stephen Watts Kearney, the colonel in charge of this entire expedition, one of his 3 expeditions through this territory, and also his Dragoons, who were note takers themselves. Another good example of research that's primary in our studies would be looking at the journals kept, all the field notes kept by the very first surveyors that began surveying what became Jefferson County. They came as early as 1837 and kept going through all what became the 12 townships of Jefferson County, finishing in 1843. They were meticulous, very thorough. Any tree larger than 6 inches diameter was cataloged. So it's extraordinary as a resource for us to know what was here, as Dick was saying, what was actually like when people arrived who kept written notes of such things. So 1835, the Royal Scots Dragoons, Colonel Stephen Watts Kearney and his first United States Dragoons. John Huff was a young man. By several accounts, this is another feature of our research. We always find a differing of sources. Some say he was born in 1811, which when he came in 1835 would make him about a 24-year-old, still a young man. Other sources say he was about 19 or 20. He lived, in any case, a ripe old age, up to 84, at least, in terms of being here all the way through 1896. And there are many eyewitnesses. He became a resource whenever an oral tradition question had to be resolved. When was this baby born? Who was the first child born in Jefferson County? And he would say not just the year, but the month. Well, July or August of 1837. And his word was law, because he had been there the whole time. He lived 60 years in this county. So John Huff came as a young man in search of honey. And he found, to his great delight, lots of basswood trees that he would carve his initials into. That was the practice of the day, as a claim of sorts, saying this tree where the bees are going to create lots of honey will belong to me. 100 miles further east from here was the only mill and the only store with goods that he could count on was closer, but it was still 50 miles back to Burlington. John Huff had the misfortune that followed some great fortune and ended up being at least semi-fortunate. And I'll tell you the story. In 1835, he found several trees and was able to fill 3 casks, 3 huge barrels full of honey, sweet honey from these bee trees that he was seeing dollar signs with, quite understandably. And he loaded up a canoe on the Skunk River near where was Rome, Iowa today. And unfortunately, it capsized. This was early November. It was cold, but capsized was his shoes, his rifle, all his equipment, and his honey. He tried and was able to get one of the barrels out and put it by a bush, and it was actually guarded quite honorably by the Iowa, who were there really to protect him, as well as to be there in curiosity to see what he was going to do. He had to leave. They had no possible equipment, and he had no money. So he walked barefoot all the way back to Burlington, 50 miles, freezing every night, a little bit of sunshine in the daytime, and over an 11-day period made it finally through there, and had to go and speak to a man he revered the rest of his life. And Mr. Sullivan, let me think of Mr. Sullivan.
Ross.
Yes, Mr. Sullivan Ross, who heard John Huff's story and believed it. And this was an indicator of the character of people on the frontier. They helped each other. This young man said, obviously he had no shoes, he had no money, he had a big story, but it was a believable story. And so Mr. Sullivan Ross said, I will give you grappling equipment. You can go back, you can pay me later. So John Huff went back. He didn't recover it all. The Native Americans who had guarded it for him did not take it. They were completely honorable. They tried to help him retrieve one of the casks he was unable to get out of the Skunk River at the bottom. But he got enough to be able to float downstream, go to the Mississippi, go to Carthage, Illinois, where he was able to command a happy ending, a princely sum of 15 cents per gallon for his honey. It would be worth far more nowadays. And the story makes it worth far more than that too. Go ahead, Dick.
Well, one of the things I just wanted to say is honey is a very interesting concept, because when the people first come to this area, first of all, Jefferson County has this bee tree situation. We have a lot of these basswood trees or linden trees, American lindens, and they have these very sweet smelling flowers that come out right around this time of year. And interestingly enough, I've actually tasted the basswood honey. It's really remarkable. So there was a market for this product, and it was a sustainable product. He could mark his trees. Everyone would keep an honor. There was honor amongst the people who were these bee tree hunters and so on. And then he would be able to harvest the honey and come back again another time in the year and harvest again. So early on, when you haven't even planted anything or anything, honey becomes an important thing. As a matter of fact, if we have time later, and I don't know if we will, we'll tell you there was almost a war that was started because
between
of
Missouri and Iowa
yeah.
over the revenue from bee trees. So we'll save that. Hope we have time.
Just to review a little bit, with the Black Hawk Purchase of 1832, Henry County extended 6 miles west of the Skunk River at that time. That map there shows the two purchases of what is now Jefferson County, and how one of them went about halfway right into like basically where Fairfield is. And we were all part of Henry County at one point, basically. And then with the second purchase, they decided to make a new county. The county needed 2 representatives. Probably one was going to be Huff. So they decided to get together and say, well, who else is going to be our representative? And by the way, the representatives reported not to Des Moines. There was no Des Moines. It was to the Iowa Territorial Legislature, which had been set up by the current governor at the time, who had been from Ohio. I've forgotten his name, but he
weren't a territory yet.
Yeah, he had set it up as a territorial legislator to start to get law into this kind of lawless area. It was the Wild West, right? So the residents of that part of Henry County, which now were going to become this new county, the ones that were to the west of Skunk River, decided to get together in what they called the Grand Barbecue in Lockridge. So hopefully most of you know where Lockridge is. It's I don't know, maybe 5 miles from here to the east of Fairfield right now. So I've learn a little more about Lockridge, a lot more, but just imagine that there are these people that get together and they kind of had their own identity. They really weren't like the people from Mount Pleasant, which had grown into a decent sized area already, but they kind of had they were the they were in the forefront of the new wild territory, right? And they said, let's have a party. We'll decide who's the other representatives at the party. So they had the grand barbecue, a big fire, probably some drinking, some food, like what we would think of maybe like a potluck. And a man, of course, Coop was a man of substantial credentials. And I think it was pretty well known that Coop was going to be there and be a part of it. But people were also going to give some speeches, which was the thing at the time, and there was going to be a big feast. So everyone came after a full day's work. The account of it says a fiddle in skillful hands added to the entertainment. A stag dance increased the enjoyment. That's when the guys come out there and dance and show their stuff. And in the hilarity of the moment, it was resolved that they would vote for no man who did not take part in the dance. If you can't do the jig, you're not going to represent us because we're a fun-loving people. And I love that. I just thought that made so much sense. So everyone danced except for there was a Methodist preacher, Jesse Payne, who said, hey, I'm a Methodist preacher. Exemption. I don't dance. That's not part of my religion. And they said, okay, the preacher's got a special dispensation, if you will. He doesn't have to dance. He could still be voted for, but everybody else had to, except for there was a guy named L.B. Hughes who was actually from Virginia. And he says, I don't do the jig that you do. I do my own jig. And they go, well, then you're out because you got to do the jig or else. And he said, give me an opportunity. Give me a chance. I do a jig that I think you'll like. It's just different. And so he proposed that somebody pat Juba. Pat Juba means that they do some kind of patting on a rock or on, imagine that, some kind of utensil or something to keep a beat for him to do his dance. And then he tried what he called the Virginia jig, which was most probably learned from slaves in Virginia area, because it was what I can say from studying and doing some research, the early days of tap, tap dance. And I would say it looks to me like, when I see it performed, like a combination of tap and like Irish river dance or something, okay? But he did it. And at the time, he so pleased the crowd by his antics that he was called out again and again. And it's stated in the records that he received every vote cast in the precinct. So Coop was also elected as a representative. And I just think that's a great story. It's like, what does it say about the people of the area? They elect the most senior and substantial, credentialed person in Coop, Colonel Coop. And then they elect the guy who did a dance that made him feel great. And they made him do it again. And he had the nerve to say, hey, I want to show you this. This is fun. And that there was an adventure and a fun side of these people. And it was reflected in that story. I thought you'd all enjoy that. Oh, should I tell this story about the
land office? The land association? Absolutely.
Okay, I'm going to tell you this now. Now, in our film, I'm hoping to talk Judge
local magistrate
Gukin to do this. Myron's a great guy, and I think he's agreed to tell this story. But I'm going to just tell you a little bit about it. So I'm not going to read it. I'm just going to tell you what I know about it very quickly. So there's this dispute between two guys about land. Now, at that time, there wasn't the big sheriff and this and that. They all just figured it out together and moved on. And there's plenty of land, but once in a while there'd be a dispute because people are staking out land saying, this is my 80 acres, this is my 80 acres. And so what happened is there was a disagreement between two guys that had land, wooded land, which was more in demand at the time.
Near water.
Near water. Most of the wooded land is near a creek or that's why the woods are there. And or a stream, and that gives them something to feed their livestock and grow crops and have for their family to have some water. So at those times, that land was more important than the flat plains of tall prairie grass. And so these two guys had land, but they had a disagreement over another piece of land. So the laws of honor prevailed, and they met with a group that were basically like a court, but it was just a group of people called the Claims
There's no county
Committee.
yet. There's no law. There's no legal
Right.
authority. This is just collective decision-making by the people who happen to live there.
Right, and these claim associations kind of cropped up of kind of senior people in the area that would kind of make these decisions, and everybody went with it. It wasn't a matter of, well, I don't agree. There's no appeals court. It just went with it. And that kept things moving, etc. So usually it was just men regarded their individual word as good as their bond. And so they just dealt with it together. But basically there was these two guys that had a problem. They got together and they said, I want this land, it's mine. And it's an additional land over and above what they had. And the other said, I do. And so the claim committee got together in the middle of the winter on the land, and they said, okay, your job is to provide the whiskey that we'll need for this claims committee meeting, this decision meeting. We'll meet at the location on the property, and they did. They had a circle that they met with a fire, and after 2 turns around the circle with the whiskey provided by the 2 complainants, if you will, or the 2 people that were had the dispute, the committee heard everyone and heard their complaints. And when the evidence was all in, the committee retired to a fallen tree some distance from the fire and swept the snow from the log and sat down and deliberated on their judgment. And after a brief consultation, they returned to the fire and they declared themselves ready to report. The report was in the words of the following words. It says, we find that aside from this 80-acre lot, Mr. Jones has claimed all the timberland he needs, and Mr. Smith has claimed all that he can possibly purchase. The names, by the way, are not correct. When the story was told, they were changed. At the approaching land sale. Therefore, we decide that Mr. Brown, who lately settled among us and who holds a prairie claim, he has no timber, and that as he can get none within a reasonable distance, he shall have the 80-acre of timber. So they gave it to a third party who they wanted to have be a part of the community and had no timberland. The other 2 gentlemen agreed one more time around with a jug of whiskey, and they all left peaceably, and the decision was made.
King Solomon would have been proud.
I thought it was great. It tells you something about the people then and how they work together for a common good. It's not necessarily entrepreneurial, but in some ways I think it is, because it's the earliest days of law. And how people really based it on how they treated each other rightly, and went from there. I just thought that was great. I loved also the fact that when they told the story, they said when it was all done, the jug went around one more time, and then the settlers departed for their homes, fully satisfied that there was many a slip twixt the cup and the lip, which is that Shakespeare? I think
good enough for us.
Yeah. Anyway. Very cool little story. Thank you for letting me share that with you. Lawrence, I don't know how much we want to tell them, but could you tell them a little bit about the mills? Because I think this is our research in the mills. This is now we're getting into entrepreneurial stories of businesses cropping up. So can you tell us why and the basics?
You know, people like John Huff were just going to searching for what nature had already provided. Mills utilize what nature provided in the forms of water power from our rivers in this area, but they brought in man-made machinery. in order to take advantage of that and multiply the productivity and reduce the workload. People are unable to grind their own grain without going back 100 miles east into Illinois. And so very quickly, 1838, they're on Brush Creek here in Jefferson County, we find our first mill. Here in what's now Fairfield, we find mills only a few years later. One was built by Mr. McGinley in 1855, about half a mile on what we would say 900 South Main Street nowadays. And it was a 3-story mill. So some of these were quite elaborate, and they became mini malls of sorts. And I know you'll be able to tell us about perhaps the most famous of them. Many mills were made of wood and of course were subject to fires. So again and again, we had a second mill, Mr. Hunsinger, on the grounds of what's now the Lutheran Church, had a mill that burned down. And Mr. Hunsinger, being a pious man, in fact decided, well, I'm going to donate, our family will donate this land for the Lutheran Church. And so it's been there ever since. In 1875, the same family kept the mill tradition going. And this is just one thread of the idea of taking advantage of what nature gives and utilizing the mechanical know-how of men and women to create carding mills for wool, to create mills for grinding grain, to create sawmills so they could build buildings, all of those utilizing that water power from our nearby rivers, quite simply.
One of the things that I think is so fascinating about our research of this time is the natural disasters, if you will, that really befell some of those early pioneers. Since all the buildings were pretty much wooden, you found a lot of fires that put people out of business for years.
And no insurance, so it'd start over, good luck.
And then the other thing was the floods. So there was a flood actually from one of the gentlemen that I am going to tell you about. And his name is Silas Deeds, and Deeds put up a water mill on the Skunk River in what became Jefferson County. It was right on the Skunk. It actually is only one block east of the river starts Henry County, but that block was enough to include Silas Deeds' mill. About 20 years later, that mill burned down, by the way, and a larger and bigger structure was erected. And just to give you an idea, at that mill, which was called Merrimack Mills, and you can see the picture there, there was the mill, which then became a 3-story mill and a basement, a store. So the mill was used as a grist mill and a flour mill. Grist being a rougher form of grinding corn, and it could be used for certain foods, but also used for feed for animals. And then the flour is, the more refined stuff, as you know. So they also had a carding mill, so that the women who came, now the men who, they put these mills on the Skunk River about 20 miles from each other, because it takes about a day. A journey is about 10 miles by wagon, right? So if you're as far away, if it's 20 miles apart, you can only be 10 miles away, okay, basically. That was the thought. And then people would sometimes go to these mills and wait even a day to get their grain milled. And then sometimes they would leave 10% of the grain there. And that was one of the ways they paid. Well, when that grain stays there, or that flour stays there, that's able to be sold. So they built a store. So now there's a grain mill, a store. The women would leave the wool from their sheep, and that would then be carded. I don't know a lot about this, but basically turned into something that they could then yarn or something like that. This is not my strength. I'm still learning. So that was another good then that they could make use of. And then there was also this beautiful building that Deeds had made. And he did it by bringing from the east a huge saw. Well, that saw ends up being the start of, because some of the farmers go, well, I got a log cabin, but I like that lumber and that beautiful Jefferson County lumber. So they started making lumber, and they started a sawmill. So now there's grist mill, flour mill, carding mill, sawmill, store. It's like a mini mall, basically, on the Skunk River.
And
Yeah,
hotel.
we actually have from the Stan Plum and Mark Schaefer from the I don't know if you
museum,
can see that.
From our museum.
Basically, there is from our museum a map that I'm using that I actually had printed out and laminated, that I'm identifying where each of these stores and where the mill is. And as you can see, that's identified as the Skunk River. I'm just sharing that with you. I wasn't gonna, but it just gives you an idea of some of the resources. And that's at hand, by the way, because I use it so often. So it actually was an amazing thing that Silas Deeds did. Eventually, Deeds sold his mill. He died, actually, and sold the mill to some other gentlemen, and then they ended up growing that mill in a different way, and the mill stayed there until the end of the 1800s. It went through a whole bunch of things, but at some point it was really substantial. The mill had 5 sets of double rolls and a single. It was driven by a Moline reaction water wheels.
Moline.
So anyway, that's where you were born, right? And raised?
I was Davenport, but I grew up in Moline.
Yeah. So anyway, I want to tell you about this because just to give you an idea of some of the research we're doing, I actually found that all of the mills that Lawrence talked about, there's 4 or 5 here locally that kind of went into business and went out of business and then came back into business and worked for 4 years and then went out on little streams that would power the mill enough to get things going. If they didn't have a mill, they would use those, what did I call them? Hominy wheels or something like that I was talking to you about? Hominy blocks. Yes. Hominy blocks is basically a piece of wood and a makeshift other piece of wood that was like a mortar pestle thing. Yeah. So interesting way that, don't forget, people had to take this grain that they were growing and turn it into something that would take care of their cattle or whatever they had or their family. And a lot of cornmeal was eaten. I was talking to some people at these mills, and they were just saying that, a lot of cornmeal. By the way, so I go do research. There's no mills by 1900 or so. All these mills went out because as they got bigger, more and more transportation, the mills got bigger and bigger. Eventually, you got places like General Mills that they shipped all their grain to and so on. But back then, it was more local. Talk about buy local and stay local. Everything was local. It was milled locally and so on. And what I love is that after these guys, Rogers built it and so on, you see this little picture, and on the top of the roof, you can see that little top cupola and that ironwork. Well, I did research and I heard that maybe the top of that roof was actually taken and used as a shed for one of the people who still lived there, who last owned the family that last owned the Merrimack Mills. And that was the Saltzman family. We went there, we bought a drone up in the air, and we found out that sure enough, on the top there is parts of that ironwork is still there. I met with Peter Saltzman, a wonderful guy who is a bit of a hermit at times, but he is a wonderful man who knew a lot about it, was not happy about kind of being approached about this because he didn't think it was that big a deal. He said his mom knew a lot more than he knew too. But he was a good man, and he shared a lot of things with us. And the people I came with said, you have no idea how important this is to Dick, because I feel like this is one of our first major businesses in Jefferson County from that early time, we're dealing with around 1850. And this place was really happening. Of course, it served Mount Pleasant more than it served Fairfield, because Fairfield really was just getting going then. But it was still a Jefferson County business. And he said, well, if you really want to, go ahead. He goes, you're going to ask a few questions. And then he said, at some point he said, okay, that's it. And we were done. But before we left, he said, hey, if it means that much to you, why don't you go get him this? And he told the person that was with me. And I can't tell you how much this meant to me. He actually gave me some of that iron top. He said, I just want you to have this, that you care so much about it. And I wanted to show it to all of you. Eventually, I'll be sharing this with the museum. And our group, Fairfield Productions, is a nonprofit group. I don't take any of this and keep it myself, but I wanted you to see that. That really made me feel great. And I really appreciated Peter Saltzman and the knowledge he shared with me. So cool, wasn't it? So, all right, well, I think that's enough of that. I want to, Lawrence, I want you to talk about one of the other businesses that were one of the first businesses in Fairfield that there's a big deal about. Matter of fact, when I went to the museum in Des Moines, this person's, one of his products was highly, was highlighted in the actual Iowa Museum there in Des Moines. It was really something to see from Fairfield.
So historical societies have long appreciated the master weaving skills of Daniel Stevenson. He came from an English family of weavers, came to the United States as a teenager in 1840 and wended his way gradually to Fairfield. In 1852, he set up shop. It was at 304 East Burlington Avenue, not far away at all. And he brought his loom. It was the first machine in the city of Fairfield, 1852, and he began making extraordinary coverlets. We would call them maybe comforter covers. He wove them with extraordinary skill. You can see that he inscribed everything made by D. Stevenson, Fairfield, Jefferson County, Iowa, and he inscribed it with the date. This is very prominent letters. The designs that Stevenson came up with were not the customary geometric straight line designs at all, but curved. He had birds, he had circles. It just remarkable inventiveness that has landed his draft book, or what we would call, his pattern book, in the Art Institute in Chicago to this day. So not only here in the state of Iowa at the Historical Society, but farther away, he is the stuff of legend in terms of weaving. To this very day, there are people who covet his coverlets as fourth generation heirloom, for example, for which when he wove these, he used locally carded wool that he dyed himself. The children of the town would press up against the windows to watch and listen to the shuttle flying on the only machine in town, all powered, of course, by Stevenson's foot. And so this master weaver, Daniel Stevenson, charged only $3.50 at maximum $5 for each of these amazing coverlets. And he did that for about 25 years, from 1852 to 1877, when there was a sudden drop-off nationally in the interest in having coverlets made. But we have a few. There are 11 or 12 that we're aware of around the nation. And as I said, there are collector's items. Dick, you want to?
I want to mention that on our chat, Stan Plum from the museum here just said that the museum's working on a new Stevenson exhibit to show off all of their coverlets. So
Wonderful.
That's exciting.
Wonderful. So the families are willing to part with them for the exhibit. There's been talk of it. I'm delighted. Thanks, Stan.
One of the things that we're going to do in the film is to try to understand what links all of these people together, that they were so bold and doing their business, trying to make something happen these earliest days. There's a connection between them and some of the people even of today. We're going to try to make that connection in the film and share it with you. The film is going to be called Ahead of Their Time, and it should be ready for you by, sometime in early next year, as long as we have the permissions to do our interviews. So thank you for that, Lawrence. That was really great. I really enjoyed. One of the other people that's known is as an early entrepreneur here is Joel Turney. I want to just tell you quickly about him, and we'll tell you more. But Joel Turney in 1848
moved as a young man from his home in Columbus, Ohio, and he was going to California to strike it rich in what was going to become the gold rush of 1849. So on his way, he came to Trenton, Iowa. Trenton is, well, it's in Henry County. It's not too far from here, about 6 miles or so east of the Merrimack Mill, by the way. And he opened up a temporary shop as a blacksmith in Trenton where he could make some money and help himself get along, right, to keep going, repairing old people's wagons, and because he was a pretty good blacksmith from what I understand. And as the gold rush of 49 came into full bloom, those 49ers found a capable mechanic that was anxious to serve them in Joel Turney. And he stayed in Trenton. Later, after the rush of the overland travel was lessened, he added a workshop that made farm wagons entirely by hand because he had noticed things that was wrong with the way their wagons were made that he thought he could do better. So Joel, guess where he got the wood for that, by the way? Yeah, the Merrimack Mills. We just found that out in some of our research. I thought that was great. So while Turney first built his wagons in 52, the origins of the actual Charter Oak Wagon brand dated to 56, and that really is what he's known for. The Civil War increased demands for his wagons, and by the end of the Civil War, the plant had expanded and reached a production of 500 wagons a year in Trenton. 500 wagons a year, what, 40 wagons a month? So, but there were several fires, several setbacks for this guy, including one around 1880 that really shut him down. But then his son and rebuilt, but not long after that, his son, who we believe had been slated to take over his business someday, died. And in 1887, Joel reconsidered an offer that was made 8 years earlier to relocate his wagon factory. So he decided to make the move. The Fairfield City fathers had finally convinced Turney to move here to Fairfield. And the community of Fairfield had several thousand residents. It was considerably larger than Trenton, and it boasted some great railroad connections and even tax incentives for him. So he and his sons, Ellsworth and Dillon Turney, built a new operation alongside the railroad tracks. It took them about a year. Production, within a year, production began and continued for a decade until another fire destroyed the entire plant in 1897. So fires were familiar tragedies for people, especially among wagon makers, because they had dry wood, flammable solvents, and open flames for the forging processes. So it's a strong brew for explosions. The famous Charter Oak wagons were built in Fairfield from 87 to 1932. They were advertised as built to wear and savors of horse flesh. There's a certain way they built them, and even the mechanisms are studied even today. We have some beautiful footage I'll tell you about in just a second, but that's a picture. You see it there. It says Charter Oak. It was taken by Jason Strong, our director of photography, and it was taken at the location of Tina Turney Thulman's place up in Riverside. And there is a Charter Oak wagon in okay condition here at the Moslem Barns, but there's also, she has a beautiful wagon, hadn't been hooked up, never been recorded in any way or photographed seriously. And we recorded it on video. They hooked up 2 beautiful horses to it. We got a chance to take drone footage, etc., on our beautiful location in Riverside. We're so happy that someone who's related to Joel Turney could actually kind of take us through this and share a lot of the family memorabilia she had. Turney went on to do a lot of new things. They had an entry-level brand that that eventually came alongside of the premium Charter Oak name, and then that was called, I think, the Fairfield. And it was offered as a wagon, a truck, a trade box, and a bobsled. And the company also made a tourney special. That was a truck. I really found it interesting to start to study tourney. We'll know more. One of the things we do in these films is actually not only just try to show you about them, but tell you, I mean, tourney eventually got almost 100,000 square feet, some of which you can still find some of those buildings at 901 North 8th Street. And even though he passed, his son Dylan took over and did a great job for quite a long time until obviously wagons became a little less necessary. I just want to tell you that I was very impressed studying him. We'll tell you more about tourney, but the thing that I think most interesting is on his way to California Goldfields, this kid stops in Trenton to help out and make a few bucks, and ends up that his stop was supposed to be temporary, but he developed a new goal. Basically, he was instead of just being blindly focused on his original goal, he traded one aspiration for another, and the result being that the Charter Oak Wagon is still highly looked at as kind of the gold standard of wagons. So I just wanted to share that with you. Well, the next thing I want to tell you about is somebody we found out about that was really interesting. We found out that there was a doctor here, and she was an interesting character. Her name was Rebecca Keck, actually Mrs. Dr. Keck, they called her, because they used both names. And I wouldn't have found out about her except for there was an author that had written a book called The Quack's Daughter. And when she wrote this book, I thought, oh, that's interesting. The Quack's Daughter. And then it was about the daughter of this woman. But as I learned about this woman, she actually had come to Fairfield at the age of 13. And her name was Rebecca Ilgenfritz. And the person who wrote about her was her great-great-granddaughter. And so I thought, oh my goodness, her name was Greta Nettleton. And I looked up Greta. I found her. We've talked. She's an amazing, amazing person. And she actually has shared some real insights into our, look at that.
Greta.
Greta is right with us today. Hi, Greta. Can you hear us?
I can.
Oh, great. Well, fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us. I was hoping you could make it, and I'm so thrilled that you did. I'm sorry we're running a little late, but thank you for waiting so patiently. We get talking about these things, and we can't stop. It's so interesting to us.
Sure.
I wonder if you could take, instead of me talking about Dr. Keck, Mrs. Dr. Keck, maybe you could tell people who are listening a little bit about her and the exciting news that I didn't spill the beans yet, but that you're going to be writing a new book about this wonderful character who started her business in Fairfield. Please share with us a little bit about Mrs. Dr. Keck.
Well, thanks so much for bringing me onto this Zoom, and thanks for including my great-great-grandmother, Mrs. Dr. Rebecca Keck, and your look back at Fairfield entrepreneurs. And Rebecca Keck was an entrepreneur beyond belief. She was amazing. She broke all the rules for Victorian ladylike behavior, and she saved her family from bankruptcy. And not only was she a skilled herbal physician, she was a marketing genius. And she eventually became one of the richest self-made businesswomen in the Midwest after the Civil War. So you can see in that image some cuts from various different front pages, from Dubuque, from Quincy, from Rock Island Argus, from the Iowa State Gazette. Her advertisements were huge and very flashy. And she, at her height, was serving between 12 and 15,000 patients.
Wow.
Because of her bold public profile, she attracted equal amounts of praise and controversy, and she was widely accused of being a quack by the members of the regular medical profession. So I'm working on a biography of Rebecca Keck called The Charmed Line. And the picture is a very special one because that's Rebecca posing with her granddaughter, Charlotte Cook, who is my grandmother. So, and she's surrounded by herbs and various different herbs that she would have used to prepare her medications. The Charmed Line, what is the meaning of that? The Charmed Line is a magical line that separates good things from bad things. And depending on who's talking, that line shifts around a lot, as I discovered during my research. And was she really a dangerous crook, as the regular doctors said? Or was she the renowned lady physician for chronic diseases who was professionally celebrated, socially respected, frank, generous, and kind-hearted? Those are direct quotes from endorsements she got from newspaper editors and also from patients. Many people took her side. So, but what's her connection to Fairfield? She emigrated to Jefferson County from Ohio with her family, which was a large one. She was one of 9 children, and most of them were already born when they arrived in 1851, and she was 13, and she grew up on a 60-acre farm near Thomas Moorman and near Mitchell Creek. I'm not as familiar. I live in New York, so I don't really know the geography, but I found all those clues from the census. She and her husband, John Keck, were both Pennsylvania Dutch, and they were descended from Amish and Mennonite refugees who fled Germany in the early 1700s to escape very fierce religious persecution. So as a girl growing up in Ohio and Iowa, she learned about traditional herbal medicines from her mother and other female relatives. And they grew some, they picked others in the fields and woods, and they spent a lot of time getting things ready, because if you got sick in the winter, the herbs were gone, of course. So you had to make everything ahead of time, and you had to be on top of it all. In those days, every woman was responsible for nursing the sick people in their families. So nursing skills and doctoring skills were expected from women, but obviously some people are much better at that than others. And she was one of the ones who was truly gifted. She was inspired to become a physician because 3 of her brothers died of tuberculosis. And untreated tuberculosis kills almost 3/4 of its victims. So it's a very, and it was epidemic or pandemic, I guess, in those days, and killed many, many people. So, and she had a younger sister who eventually died later. So of the 9 children, 4 of them died of tuberculosis. She became well known among her friends and neighbors for her ability to heal, and she specialized in treating sinus and respiratory infections. And in those days, they were referred to as catarrh. That's one of those funny Victorian words that nobody uses anymore. And it describes a bunch of symptoms. It's not a disease, but it describes congestion and basically icky mucus, phlegm, gross stuff that plugs up all the things that eye, ear, nose, and throat specialists would deal with today. That's John Keck. That's Rebecca's husband. And he was a gifted inventor and mechanic. It sounds like many, many people in Fairfield were in that line of work. There was a lot of machinery that was needed. And he opened a successful machine shop and foundry right after the Civil War. And Rebecca had 6 children between 1857 and 1868. So she went on to have a pretty large family, just like her mother. And one thing that's remarkable is all 6 of her children survived to middle age. And so she was obviously able to, at home, be a good healthcare provider. And that was, even in those days, especially in those days, something that was very difficult to do. Very few people could manage that, to raise all their children to adulthood. Let's see. So my great-grandmother, Cora, was Rebecca's fourth daughter, and she was born in 1865. And I think the odds are extremely high that she and probably all the other kids were delivered by the famous Quaker midwife, Rachel Pierce.
Yes, and we know who she is. She delivered over 1,000 babies in this county.
Without a single fatality.
Right.
It's just extraordinary. She was described by Dr. Clark as a great student of obstetrics. I would revise that as a master of the art, and she was extraordinary. So Rebecca worked with her husband. She learned how to run a business because she helped her husband to market his expensive threshers and Timothy riddles, whatever that is, I don't know. And these sold for $600 a piece. And in those days, that was something like close to $750,000. They were very large, expensive things. And so he was a mechanical genius. He was in the workshop. And my perception is that she was running the office and the marketing in the back. And as long as a woman in that society worked behind the scenes for her husband, there was no criticism of her. In fact, people would think, oh, what a great wife. She's a real prize. But her name wasn't on anything, and she was not in front of the business. So there was no controversy. So fatefully, an extension of the Chicago, Rock Island, and Pacific Railroad came through town in 1872. And local farmers obviously preferred to buy the cheaper threshing machines that came from Chicago, from the companies that we still know today, like
and from Moline, from John Deere.
Right. Well, yeah, Deere. I'm not a specialist, so I wouldn't even dare go there with all the machinery and brand names. But there was a wave of cheaper, excellent machinery that came in, and John Keck's foundry business was ruined in 6 months. That was the end. And Rebecca saw the writing on the wall, and she swiftly pivoted all their assets towards selling patent medicine based on her own recipes. So her husband formed partnerships that they needed to start up. And first with the famous Franklin Hunsinger, the miller, who was mentioned earlier in our talk today. And again, Rebecca's name was not on the product. It was her idea, it was her skill, but it was her husband and another man whose name was in the public face of the product. Dick found this just a week ago. It's the oldest ad, and I never found it because the name Keck is misspelled as Kreck. And so all my searches online skimmed right over because this was misspelled. So anyways, this ad is fabulous because it gave us so many clues about how she got her business started. And the testimonials shown there are all from real people. I looked them all up in the census, and I found out who they were, where they lived, and there's nothing fake about this ad whatsoever. So we have Keck and Hunsinger, and we have, let's see, Miss Molly Black, and Molly Patrick lived with the Mitchell family, and then she got married to Black, so she became Mrs. Molly Black. So this is all like very intimate, local Fairfield family activities, and you guys all know these people.
One of the things I found interesting about this, Greta, was that this kind of shows in the testimonial by Molly Black is from July of 1972, I believe, right? 1872. So when I look at that and say 1872, his business goes out of business a few years after that, right? Yeah. So I just thought that was fascinating because that really is a confirmation in my mind that, wow, this lady was actively doing this business. Of course, somebody probably at the Ottumwa Courier, which is where this ad was placed, might have messed up the putting the name, but the ad was a wake-up call for me to see that for sure she was doing a form of the business, maybe more locally, etc., well before his business goes out of business, and therefore has something to work with, some indications that people like what she's doing. And I want to also say, just as an insight for people into research, they say it's better to be lucky than good. Sometimes, you just do the research, and you stumble. And I stumbled across this and said, wow, somebody named Keck had this guitar Kesis thing. Okay, that's it. Now I'm like, wait a minute, it couldn't be that there's a Keck and a Keck. Then I looked more carefully, and sure enough, her name is spelt right in the testimonials. And I'm like, wow, I can't wait to tell Greta. I don't think it's better to be lucky than good. I think it's better to be lucky and good. It's better to do all the work, keep working at it, and sometimes something will just fall in your lap just when you need it. And this was a cool thing for me. And I know you have a few more things to say about this, and I want you to, but I do want you to know how much I enjoy kind of discovering about Mrs. Dr. Keck. What an amazing woman. And the fact that she's into herbs and so on in Fairfield, even today, there's a big group of people who are really into herbology, etc., and as well as traditional medicines.
Well, let me just break in.
They clash, and sometimes they don't.
Let me break in and say that I still hold out hope that someday I will find some books from her medical library, which was listed in her will, and it would have been all the herbal reference books that she used, because she continued to build up her expertise throughout her entire career. And so that medical library, unfortunately, was dispersed after her death. And I've wished that, somehow there's a library of eclectic medicine in Cincinnati, and I would love to get in there, but you'd have to look at every single book and open it up and check the flyleaf and see, is her name in it? Because there's no other way to know if it was hers or not.
Wow.
But maybe those books are out there. And it's a tremendous reservoir of knowledge, which in this day and age, there's problems with antibiotics that don't work anymore. And what she was doing is using alternative medicine to work on in chronic infections and inflammation that, nowadays we attack with antibiotics. And so she was achieving many of those same things more slowly, but steadily and for real, according to these testimonials.
12,000, 15,000 patients, that's a number that says, and not only patients, she didn't just sell them something. Greta has shown.
I'll get to that. I got it.
Oh, that'd be great.
So the Ottumwa ad was for Keck and Huntsinger. And so still the men were in charge. And they hired a couple of local youth to wholesale the product under this name for local grocers. But they didn't get very far. And they weren't selling very much. And Rebecca immediately took over, and she began to travel under her own name as a physician. And her first marketing trip was to Dubuque, and she took over in earnest after September 1873, when there was this terrible banking panic, and the crash of 1873 was one of the worst depressions of the 19th century. And her husband's business was already tanking for other reasons, and it was clear to her that it was essential that this new idea become a really important part of the business. So she started advertising under her own name, and Huntsinger's name disappears immediately. So they probably had a falling out. It's all hidden behind the scenes, but we don't see his name anymore. And her identity became a powerful marketing tool starting right away. The minute she took charge, there was steady growth, and I can see it from the number of ads and all these other signs, the frequency of her trips. And her success was based on how well she interacted with her patients and her careful follow-up with each one. And she'd follow up on each case, and she returned to these towns where she set up shop on a regular schedule. So she would give people a prescription, tell them what to do, go away, and come back a month or two later and see the same people and ask how they were doing and keep up with the cases. So that was not a snake oil salesman thing. She focused on making friends and on building relationships. Mm-hmm. And she never cheated anyone. She paid all her bills on time because she always wanted to come back and always wanted to be accepted in these communities. So in early 1874, since Huntsinger was out of the picture, then the Kecks partnered with Henry Mitchell, who was another very prominent Fairfield figure. He had a large farm. He was very progressive. He was a big wheel in the Iowa State Agricultural Society and the local county fair. And as a frequent exhibitor of major equipment, John Keck would have known him quite well. And they were all in, I'm sure, this agricultural equipment clique and all knew each other very well. And so Mitchell became the partners. So it was Keck and Mitchell. And they were probably using the now empty machine shop for a laboratory. They scrubbed it out, and then they had their bags of herbs and the bottles. And it involved lots of alcohol to make, because you have to dissolve everything in alcohol. And so then I have a whole chapter about Fairfield's dry laws and temperance.
Yes.
It's really amusing. Anyways, it's a legendary problem that medicinal spirits were frequently abused. But anyways, she was a straight arrow teetotaler, and she only used the alcohol for medicinal purposes. John Keck was still in business for all of 1874, and he was going head to head with Anthony DeMarce, who owned something called the Union Foundry. And Rebecca must have poured much of her earnings into keeping the foundry going. And they ran side-by-side ads in the industrial age newspaper. And they were pouring all this money and trying to eat each other alive. But the business was gone for both of them. So the foundry closed in the end of 1874. And my belief is that John Keck suffered a complete nervous breakdown. And his wife took charge of their future. And their two eldest daughters, Belle and Lotta, were 17 and 15, and they were very intelligent and resourceful and just as energetic and ambitious as their mother. So they were extraordinarily important in her ability to grow the business. That is such a beautiful picture. And
This is Jason Strong. Jason took this picture.
It is so hard to take a picture of a bottle. I have quite a few. I went to Mike Bergdorf's house and tried to take pictures of that same bottle, and my pictures are terrible. So that's gorgeous.
Yeah, Mike Berggraf is the guy that that actually brought this to Jason and I. We called him. He's very kind. It's the only one that we know of around here, at least. And it's actually, if you look carefully at it, you'll see it says Keck's liver and lung tonic, I think is what it says.
And a tonic would have alcohol in it. So that was, and I think he told me he found it in the pit under an outhouse.
Yes. along, I think somewhere along the Mississippi, not here, I don't think. So it's really amazing. By the way, for those of you who are in Fairfield, John Keck's foundry was north of Burlington Avenue, right on the property between 2nd and 3rd Street. So really very close to the square. And that is probably where Rebecca's first, she probably used that as her place. So
her lab.
For a while,
I'm sure they cleaned out, and the machinery they needed to bottle, since John was a mechanical genius, he would have taken the machines he already had and repurpose them so that that could assist with making enough of the product for the rapid growth, because she was, she couldn't do this on her kitchen stove.
Rita, as a researcher, and I wear a lot of hats in the Fairfield History Series, but one of them is research, and Lawrence is our director of research, but I certainly am a helper. And when I came across this bottle, which you told me that Mike had, and I called Mike, and he was kind of not so sure about me in the beginning, but like most people here in Fairfield, eventually they see the film, or they hear about it, or they see our dedication to getting this right. And then we go to take a picture of it, and I say, well, we're going to just give it to Jason and we'll film it. And I was like really careful about it. And he goes, here, you want to hold it, don't you? And I said, yes, I really do. And it was so funny when I held it. It was like the Holy Grail, because I was actually connected to Rebecca finally, directly feeling something that she had probably held in her hands. And it meant a lot to me when I get to do that with any of the people that we study, just like I showed with the mill when I got that iron grate. There is a connection you feel, and I was so thrilled. Mike has also pledged to continue to work with us and to learn more, and if he finds more bottles somewhere, he'll let us know, because I think it's very cool to see them. It connects you to it, not as well as if we had those recipes, but certainly in a way that's very direct, you know?
Yeah.
Now,
Yeah.
maybe you can share, if I think you're probably going to, but can you share how you got onto this?
Yeah, so that's coming up. So
Okay.
In January 1875, Rebecca saw how successful she could be on her own, and she set her sights on moving to Davenport, which is a bigger city and well connected to all kinds of transportation options. And in April of 75, she bought property on Brady Street in Davenport, and it was just a small building, and she opened a small clinic there. And in those days, the word for clinic was infirmary. So, and it would, patients who she couldn't treat at home, she would have them come and stay there, and she could give them better supervision. And at that exact moment, Mitchell quit the partnership. So we can surmise behind the scenes that her strong personality and her vigorous opinions about how things should be done maybe didn't mesh well with how he thought the business should be run. And we don't know. We can only guess. Maybe a novelist could come up with some great stuff. But anyways, Mitchell quit. And by October 1875, friction with her ex-business associates and other hostile people in Fairfield got so bad that she stopped advertising in the Ledger mid-October. So the next incident is something reported by Fairfield's beloved Dr. J. Frederick Clark, who was an 11-year-old boy at this moment. And his father, C.S. Clark, owned the most important drugstore right on the town square, and the Clarks lived in an apartment upstairs. So he was probably peering out the window. And in the 1930s, he wrote a history of all the doctors in Jefferson County when he was an old man. And he was so amazed by what he saw that he mentioned it 3 times in the article. And he went out of his way to mock Rebecca Keck multiple times because of this and everything else. So he really didn't like her. So anyways, the little boy...
This is one of the founders of the Jefferson County Health Center, just so we know.
Right. He was a very good doctor. I mean,
but very fixed in his opinions. You're quite right.
Yes. So he looks out the window and he sees a respectable Methodist housewife, who he's known all his life, Rebecca Keck, walking around the square wearing bloomers. Okay, bloomers were shocking garb anywhere, but maybe particularly in a very devout and sober and conservative town. So you see 2 kinds of bloomers there. On the left, Calamity Jane is wearing grubby trail gear. And on the right is the famous Civil War surgeon, Mary Walker, who won a Congressional Medal of Honor for her courage in surgery near the front. And she insisted on wearing pants, which she wore in an extremely modest way. It's hard for us to see why this was so shocking. But anyways, in those days, little boys would follow a girl wearing bloomers down the street and throw rotten fruit and rocks at them. And it was, you know, very provocative, let's put it that way, to wear bloomers. So Rebecca decided to give herself a spectacular and insolent send-off before she moved away to Davenport. She was a strong-minded woman, and she would not accept having her skills in medicines marketed under other men's names. So that was the little bit of the parting of the ways between Rebecca Keck and Fairfield. And
she tore off the scab, so to speak.
She never came back. She advertised in almost every other town in eastern Iowa for the rest of her career, but never again in Fairfield. So she was a Fairfield entrepreneur, but there was a parting of the ways. So her rapid and substantial financial success would have been difficult for any man because the patent medicine business was very difficult and competitive. And for a woman, her achievement was really quite astounding. So the question remains, was she a quack or was she a capable physician? And my great-grandmother, Cora Keck, who was her daughter, saved all her diaries. And my grandfather saved these diaries. And I read through them. And that's how I got started on all this in the first place, that I had these diaries and they're very incomplete. And when you read them, you wonder who the people are and what are they talking about. And so that led me into all of this research to try to understand who those people were and who their friends were and what they were talking about. And one of Cora's diaries is her baby diary about her daughter Charlotte as a toddler. And in one of the, there's a long sequence in which her daughter was very ill and the regular physician was treating her and she's getting sicker and sicker and sicker. And I'm going to give it away.
You know the ending.
Her husband called Mrs. Dr. Keck and said, listen, we've got to call her. And she came all the way from Chicago to Elkhart, Indiana, which is where my great-grandmother lived and my grandmother was born. And Rebecca took charge and she saved the baby's life. And the specifics of how she did it are written in detail in that diary.
Wow.
And it was never publicized. It had nothing to do with marketing. And so we can take that as a pretty, a good proxy for her way of treating and her ability to really treat an illness. So, and I'm awfully glad because I wouldn't exist if she hadn't done that. So that's the little baby sitting on the shoulder of Mrs. Dr. Keck on the book cover. So, but that book's not finished. I still have to write the final chapters. So, but while you're waiting for the book to come out,
we're hoping that the book will come out when our film comes out, and you'll come out here to Fairfield and share it with people.
So that is the book that I wrote based on Cora's diaries, and the book is called The Quack's Daughter. I'm just owning the whole quack thing, and I'm not even going to try to hide that. We're just owning it. And it's a true story about the private life of a Victorian college girl. And the young lady on the right is Cora Keck, my great-grandmother, and she was sent off to Vassar College in 1884 by Mrs. Dr. Keck. And it was a very expensive, prestigious place. And obviously, Rebecca was looking to raise the social tone of her controversial family. And Cora wrote in her diary that her mother wanted her to find an Eastern fellow for a husband. So, so that book tells all, and Cora was so spirited and so entertaining. And the book has got lots of images and family photos and illustrations. So it's a lot of fun. And my New York Library System gave me Book of the Year for 2018 with that. So
awesome. Well deserved.
So anyways, that's pretty much all I was going to say.
Well, I'm always amazed at that infirmary in that picture. It looks so huge and palatial. And then you were sharing with me that, well, she might have exaggerated the size of that a little bit in her ads.
Yeah.
But,
yeah.
I think that's cute because the thing is the one thing that's unmistakable, and that is that from an earliest time, Rebecca Ilgenfritz and then later Rebecca Keck seemed to have a reputation of really caring about people and knowing her stuff, not being a snake oil salesman, but rather being somebody who used herbs to try to build an overall program of greater health for people that included things like being outside and getting good exercise and deeply breathing and all these things that we see today. Doctors are starting to put into. The other thing I just want to mention is in my research, even Dr. Clark, when he writes about the medicine of this time, this is not like medicine today. No matter what you think of medicine today, it's so much more advanced than medicine of the time. The medicines they were giving people were medicines that had sometimes poisonous compounds in them, like mercury. That's right. And so They were, this wasn't like, oh, there's medicine with the big hospitals, and then there was this lady doing herbs. There was different competing forms of medicine at the time, and medicine as we know it, allopathic medicine or whatever, was at a very young, early age. Maybe there wasn't bloodletting, I don't know.
Let me just break in something I found from the University of Michigan Medical School that really knocked my socks off, is that as late as 1893, there was a professor there who considered germ theory to be quackery. Oh. And there was a new head of the Michigan Medical School who fired him because he said, listen, come on, we've got germs out there and we're going to learn how to fight them. So that guy became the head of public health for the city of Detroit. And so you can imagine in the 1890s, this man doesn't even believe that, typhoid or foodborne illnesses are caused by germs.
So, and he now has a cable news show. No, I'm just kidding.
It took a long time for people to, it's a very slow thing. People believe what their parents told them about medicine. And it's a reasonable thing. I mean, you want to be conservative. You want to go with what you know. And so I talk a lot about that psychological stuff.
Really excellent.
Could I ask, please, in the dollars of today, was your great-great-grandmother a millionaire?
I think unquestionably she would have had the equivalent of millions of dollars, but she wasn't super rich. There was a tremendous income inequality. And I discovered that by looking at what the Vassar girls were spending on their dresses. And Cora was allowed $45 for the whole year for her dressmaking budget. And she was a classmate of Harry Thaw's daughter. You remember, or Harry, I forget which Thaw. Anyway, she's related to the guy who shot Stanford White. And she wrote to her father and said, oh, I would like to buy a wedding gift for my friend that costs $400. Mm-hmm. So just a wedding gift for her was going to be 10 times more than the entire clothing budget for Cora. So Cora was, even though her mother was earning a lot of money, I would say they were maybe upper middle class. And then we have these plutocrats who could spend money like water. They couldn't even imagine. $45 for them was a tip to the coachman. And that was Cora's entire clothing budget. So it's tricky to get the money thing right. You have to look at these things that people spend their money on.
I would say certainly she had an extremely successful practice, and one that I think made her, at least at a certain point, not have a big want for money or feeling desperate. But at the same time, she came from nothing. And I just think that's the amazing thing about her work and the work of her as a woman. We in doing research and history consistently find that the stories of the women in any field are not told quite as often as the stories of men. And so for you to bring this out for us, help us to understand it better. We can't tell you how much we appreciate it, Greta. Thank you. Thanks for being with us today. And we hope that you do come out, if it works out, that things are a little easier by the time we come out with our film. We hope you come out and join us, bring tons of books, because we know people will have an interest in Mrs. Dr. Keck and her story. And if not, well, certainly I know people can buy The Quack's Daughter on Amazon, or they can even go
I want to actually urge people, you can get it on Amazon, but if you buy it directly from University of Iowa Press, then Amazon doesn't take, they don't take the, in other words, the press gets the money, not Amazon.
Great.
So it's the same price. It's the same price either way, but it's just, that's it.
So University of Iowa Press, just look, do a search for that, and then look for that book, The Quack's Daughter, and then
click right there, and it comes directly from the University of Chicago Press distribution.
Thank you so much for being with us, Greta. We really appreciate it.
Thank you very much for inviting me to join you. It was totally a pleasure.
Well, it's great. So there we hear it from Greta Nettleton. Lawrence, I know that our time is pretty much up. Yes. I just want to say that for those that are saying, how about William Loudon? I had a whole thing prepared on William Loudon. He's an amazing character. We're going to be bringing him out in our book. We have met someone who has a whole museum. A big chunk of it is devoted to William Loudon. William Loudon was one of 9 children. He was not well, he was ill, and therefore he couldn't help out on the farm. And here in Fairfield, actually he was, his family was in Glasgow. So if you know where Glasgow is, it's, he was sick often. So his brothers would do the farm work, and he would come up with ideas to save energy, being able to make it easier to do that farm work. It ended up that William Loudon, just to give you an idea, had to this day, if you look up the patents that are granted to people in Fairfield, William Loudon still holds 22% of the patents, or he was granted 22% of all the patents that were ever granted in Fairfield. That gives you something, an idea. He went broke with great products that he had developed, and then his brother got involved, and his products ended up having a good business mind connected, and he was able to focus on what he was doing, which was inventing things. So R.B. Loudon took over the business as the chief financial agent. C.J. Fulton threw in the money, as we know that name, and they incorporated under the Loudon Company, and that allowed William to do some of the great things he did. His name, the Loudon name, became synonymous with quality in farm implement products, in farm-related, barn-related products, a name that was stamped boldly on almost every one of their products. His biggest strength was making farm life easier. And it's been said that Loudon did it for barns what Cyrus McCormick did for reapers and John Deere did for the plow.
That's right. That's right.
So I didn't realize what a big deal William Loudon was until I started looking more deeply into it. And their products eventually got sold all over the world, got sold in Russia and all over the place. And the other thing is that he had other locations eventually, St. Paul, Minnesota, Kansas City, Missouri. We saw something on the East Coast that had their name on it. Their products were in Scotland and France, and like I said, Russia. Through his success, William Loudon remained loyal to his hometown of Fairfield. He never failed to mention Fairfield wherever he went. And I will tell you, we are doing more and more research on this. Anyone who has information on William Loudon you want to share with us, fantastic. We're going to be, we've already met with a few people, with Tom Loudon. We've met with Mr. McCoy, Tom's cousin, I believe, in Mount Pleasant, who is really helpful. And we're meeting with this gentleman who has this museum. We're going to be showing you that in our new film. We're going to be showing you all about other entrepreneurs from Fairfield throughout the time periods, not just this time period that we're talking to you up till 1900, but all the way through the 1900s. I am so excited about this film and excited that we've had a chance to share with you some of the research we've done of the early entrepreneurs of Fairfield. I want to thank Jason Strong from Fairfield Media Center. Jason, can you come on, will you please? If you would, I would really want you to hop on and thank you.
Thanks,
if you don't, there you are.
All right, Jason.
In that advanced studio. And thank you very much, Jason, for all the work you've done to help us make this work, and even put on Greta. That was such a delight to have her join us. Thank you, everyone, for watching, whether you watched live or whether you watched the show later on. Thank you very much. Really a thrill to have you. Lawrence, Eyre, thank you. Thanks for being with us.
Dick. Thanks,
and again,
Jason.
thanks to Humanities Iowa for your opportunity, the Fairfield Public Library, and Fairfield Media Center. This is Dick DeAngelis signing off. Thanks a lot for joining us today.